My name is Kendall Barnes, and this is Creature Conflict, an audio podcast aimed to inform people about invasive species. In this episode, listen to my interview with John Odenkirk. What is an invasive species?
That is a very important question. And that was something that I figured should and might come up. If you look up the definition in a given dictionary, in most cases, it will say that an invasive species is a non-native or alien species that causes economic or ecologic damage. And I think that's a fairly good definition, pretty straightforward, and I think gets to the root of the situation. Now, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the federal government, has adopted a definition similar to that, but after that descriptor, there is a phrase "or may." And I think that is sort of where we get into a little bit of a slippery situation. It's because that's very subjective. It's not subjective if something causes economic or ecologic damage. It is subjective if it may, to me anyway. And so, because we're a state agency, and most state agencies like Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources get their funding, a portion of their funding via the federal government, something called Sport, Fish, and Restoration. It's a federal excise tax on fishing equipment, and it's doled back out to the states based on how much money they spend on habitat enhancement and things to promote fishing and license holders, people that fish. And so a large portion of our funding it's related directly to hunters and fishermen, but for us on the aquatic side of it, it's related to fishing, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, the federal government, is the agency that oversees that funneling of monies. And so essentially we adopt by default their definition of invasive. So our definition is synonymous with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service definition of invasive, which is somewhat subjective because it says that it causes damage or it might. So there you have it.
So you work as a district biologist with Virginia's Wildlife Resources,
Right.
Department of Wildlife Resources. How often do you deal with invasive species?
Well, it gets, again, we come back to what we just talked about. What is the definition of invasive? Because to me, it's they're like, say, for instance, blue catfish. Blue catfish is another fish similar with snakehead that has been implicated as an invasive fish. The difference being that instead of being from Asia, the blue catfish is from America, just not from Virginia. And lo and behold, our agency, former agency, actually stocked the blue catfish into Virginia rivers in the 1970s, when that was sort of a preferred management philosophy. There wasn't a whole lot of thought given about what might happen down the road. It's talking about a half a century ago. Science is, at least in terms of fisheries management, has evolved quite a bit in a half a century. Be that as it may, blue catfish potentially have the potential to be a lot more problematic than northern snakeheads, in my opinion. So I think most people would be satisfied with saying blue catfish are invasive. We have hydrilla is an aquatic plant. Hydrilla has so many beneficial qualities. A lot of people, in fact, VDACs, the Virginia Department of VDACs, Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. I think I got that right. They have classified hydrilla as a noxious weed, essentially it's not native. So basically, their definition is hydrilla is an invasive. Hydrilla saved the Potomac River in conjunction with the Clean Water Act 1972. Again, my opinion. And not just my opinion. Nancy Ribicki and some other famous aquatic botanists have determined that hydrilla in the Clean Water Act, created a scenario in the Potomac River in the 70s that allowed for the return of native vegetation, because hydrilla actually cleaned the water by nutrient cycling, stabilizing the sediment, things like that, allowed for conditions to exist so we could have native vegetation return, which we have now. We have a salad, we have a plethora of different SAV, submerged aquatic vegetation. That has set the stage for the Potomac to become one of the premier bass fisheries in the country, if not the world. So, and the snakehead fishery. So, if you want to say how often do I deal with invasives, you can almost say on a daily basis, because then you throw like another aquatic plant like a water chestnut, which you could argue maybe is more truly invasive than another aquatic plant like hydrilla. So you get to start getting into the minutia of the splitting hairs with different species that aren't native here. I mean, if you look at the fish assemblage in the Potomac River, half of the fish we see out there right now are not native. Okay, largemouth bass, right? Smallmouth bass. We love those fish, but they're not native. Were they invasive in 1878 whenever they were introduced? Hell yeah, I'm sure they were. We don't think of them as invasive now, though, do we? We think them as beneficial naturalized species. The distinction there. So it's an odd conundrum we find ourselves in when we start trying to classify different organisms based on some label.
Yeah, I talked to Dr. Amy Fowler earlier this week, and she had a very similar answer that that invasive species are very complex in what you consider
Right.
them. And
yeah. You can't just say it's invasive and treat it some way, right? Everyone is different. They're everyone. And so they have to be looked at in their own light, in their own ecology, their own life history and biology, and then to come up with some sort of a management, recommendation or philosophy on how to deal with it, if it even needs to be dealt with.
right. So you said you deal with invasive species almost daily. How often do you deal with the northern snakehead where you are?
Well, the northern snakehead has been illegally stocked in almost every lake in my work area. I work in Northern Virginia District. So Mike Eisel and I, he's my fellow biologist up here, we've got 12 counties. We're responsible for all public water in 12 counties, which includes the tidal Potomac tributaries, the Rappahannock tidal and non-tidal down to Port Royal. We've got a lot of reservoirs like Lake Anna, Occoquan Reservoir. And so basically we got about 24 reservoirs that are managed for fishing and a bunch of rivers and streams. And snakeheads essentially have been introduced illegally into the reservoirs by people. Now they have moved on their own and through some of the river systems. They're not jumping drainages. Well, they probably jumped the drainage from the Potomac to the Rappahannock, but they're not going to jump a lot of drainages. Human intervention is going to help them. So essentially, when you look at the spread of snakeheads due to their own innate migration capabilities and due to the human illegal transport, I'm essentially dealing with snakeheads at some level during field season. Well, not even now when I'm analyzing data and writing reports, almost on a daily basis. Basically dealing with snakeheads almost daily, because everything now that I do, because my work area, I was at the epicenter of the snakehead colonization in 2004. Actually, they colonized before that, but that's when we found out about them. That has sort of jaded the perspective of everything I do, because it's put under that lens, as well as there's something happening or what's going on with the snakehead population or in the other communities. What's the interaction? So it's all sort of cast in this light as people have moved them.
So sorry. I know you mentioned them jumping drainages and stuff. What, in your opinion, makes them such like a prolific invader? Why can they survive so well and spread so well?
So I would absolutely, at this point, other than I'm going along with the Fish and Wildlife Service definition of invasive, I'd have to say they are invasive. But in terms of actually proving it, I would say no, they're not yet. They might be, but they're not yet. But that's not to say they're not good migrants. They're good colonists. They're absolutely good colonists. They can migrate upstream. They're good. They're athletic. They're good jumpers, like our anadromous fish that we're removing dams to try to get these fish up to their ancestral spawning grounds, and they can't make it over like a tiny little gradient barrier. Snakeheads, they'll go over almost anything. They can jump so well. They go downstream on freshets. They can tolerate salinity that we didn't think they could tolerate. They can tolerate low oxygen because they breathe air. So they've got a whole bunch of competitive advantages that allow them to prosper and survive and colonize new areas. So I think the whole crux of the thing is that you have to look at abundance. So they continue to expand their range, albeit at a slower rate than I initially thought they would. But even with human intervention, they're still expanding their range at a relatively fast pace. But what's happening is in the areas where they've newly colonized, the numbers shoot up. But once they've established for a decade or so, give or take a year or two, they seem to always, so far anyway, have seemed to establish a peak, and then there's a recession from that peak into a much lower abundance. And we've seen that in almost all the systems they've been introduced in so far. So I think it will be a far different story if you look at that abundance growth curve. Initially, if it's going up at a really steep angle, like a ski jump, if it didn't hit a plateau at some point, we'd be talking a different story. But because it does seem to hit a plateau, essentially an exponential level below, say, bass abundance or some equivalent in that ecological niche, that they just haven't had the capability to exert some sort of truly invasive criteria on the community. And why hasn't that happened? I think it's a combination of exploitation. It's labeled as a commercial fish, as well as recreation. People like to eat them. They can be sold. And there's assimilation, right? The ecosystems, they come in context, and things sort of sort out. The process gets sorted out. No longer a novel organism after a decade, right? Other things, be it an osprey or an eagle or heron or a white perch hitting a snakehead nest. All these other organisms are figuring out that, hey, we can exploit this as well. So I think it's a combination of human exploitation, or harvest, if you will, as well as ecological assimilation.
Right.
So
So, how was the northern snakehead introduced here in Virginia?
we don't know for sure. We know that in other cases it was introduced haphazardly, if you want to call it that, because people had it for some other reason and didn't want to kill it. There are a number of different theories, prayer release, because they just didn't want to kill a pet. More likely than not, it seems like it was probably established for some intentional use, probably for the food market or because somebody liked it and wanted it. That unless somebody makes a deathbed confession, which hadn't happened yet, we'll probably never know who put those fish in the tidal Potomac. But they are different than the fish that were in Maryland back in 02 and 03. We've looked at the genetics on that, and they're not from the same gene pool. So we do know that it was a separate introduction. And then most of the fish that are now in the mid-Atlantic have resulted from this pool, from our tidal Potomac system. So we could take guesses at it, but we don't know for sure.
So, what effects have the northern snakehead had on the ecosystems where they've been introduced?
From our perspective here in Virginia, what we've seen, and we're not looking at everything. I can't tell you, that they haven't caused some influence on some species that we have yet to evaluate. But based on what they're eating, and the lion's share of what they're eating is banded killifish, which is a native minnow in the tidal rivers, and centrarchids. Notably, that's a sunfish family of fish, and there's a genus within the sunfish family called Lepomis, 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 and that's the genus, the genre of the round sunfishes. When people say sunny, I call it a sunny sunfish. You're generally talking about a bluegill or a redbreast or a red ear, a fish like that, and those are the Lepomis genre. And that's the number one food item if you look at weight of consumed biomass, that the snakeheads go for that in lakes or rivers. So in rivers, if you look at numbers, it's killifish, the little minnows. If you look at the weight, which is probably a better way to look at what's the most meaningful component of the diet, then it's bluegill and pumpkin seeds, which are two Lepomis species. Both of them are non-native, in lakes or rivers. And we have yet to see those numbers decline. In fact, we published a paper a few years ago that looking at lakes, because we had much better data in lakes. Because when we're do our river work, we're not picking up bluegill and pumpkin seeds. We're looking at bass. We're looking at snakeheads. We're looking at bowfin if you're in the Rappahannock. We looked at yellow perch for a while in the Potomac, but we don't have the ability to do what we call a quantitative survey of all fish. It would be simply overwhelming. There's just the Potomac River is a fish factory, and we don't have the live well capacity or the staff to pick up all the fish that we would get in a typical electrofishing run. But we do know, looking at other sources of data, like George Mason has done a larval fish survey in Pohick Bay, which is also known as Gunston Cove, which is one of our study creeks, where we've been collecting snakehead data now for over 20 years, since 2004. Their data suggests that the banded killifish numbers have actually increased in Pohick Bay, and that's the snakehead's number one food item. So essentially, snakeheads are an opportunistic feeder. I honestly don't think they care if it's a bluegill or a killifish. If they're hungry and there is a fish in front of its yap, it's going to just inhale it and move on. And actually not move on. They don't move hardly at all, except for a little bit of migration before spawning in April. But they're pretty lazy fish. But they're opportunistic. That's my point. And you have to look at, well, where do they don't move much out of that heavily vegetated, shallow habitat. And what are the other species that are there? Pumpkin seeds, bluegill, and banded killifish. So that's what they're eating. They're extremely opportunistic. They're going to eat whatever in their habitat, and those are almost always what's in their habitat. So what we can say is that the most commonly consumed, and I'm talking like 90% or more, food items that the snakehead is eating are not declining. Okay, so that's a pretty good case for they don't have an impact on the ecosystem. And then what's the primary predator at their niche? Largemouth bass. Actually, largemouth bass in the Rappahannock have actually increased since snakehead showed up. In the Potomac, they're stable. So you're very hard pressed to convince me the snakeheads have had an impact in an ecological scale on anything we've seen in Virginia.
That concludes the first half of my interview with John Odenkirk. Thank you for listening, and please tune in to my other episodes.